10 years ago, I was making so little money that a single unexpected bill could wreck my entire month. A flat tire meant skipping groceries for a week. A doctor's visit meant a very uncomfortable phone call to my landlord about paying rent a few days late. Today, that same bill wouldn't even register. It wouldn't change my week, let alone my month. This isn't a story about a lucky break, a big promotion, or some clever investment that took off. It's a story about one decision that quietly compounded for a decade. And honestly, the lesson underneath it isn't the one I expected to learn when I was living it. My name is Kai Cash, and normally on this channel, I break down the psychology and the math behind wealth. Today, I'm doing something different. I'm telling you exactly what my low-income years actually looked like, what I got wrong, what I got right almost by accident, and the one real lesson that came out of it. Because I think the sanitized version of the story is actually less useful than the messy true one. Subscribe if you want more honest stories like this, instead of just polished advice. Let me set the scene. I was 23. Working a job that paid barely enough to cover a small apartment, groceries, and gas, with almost nothing left over most months. I want to be specific here, because vague poverty stories don't teach anything. My take-home pay was around $2,200 a month. Rent alone was $750. After utilities, a cheap phone plan, and the absolute minimum on groceries, here's what I want you to understand about that period, because it matters for the lesson later. I wasn't being reckless. I wasn't buying anything extravagant. I was already, by most people's definition, being responsible. And I still felt like I was one bad week away from real trouble, constantly. That feeling, more than the actual numbers, is what defined those years. Not poverty exactly, but a kind of low-grade financial dread that never fully went away, even on the months when nothing went wrong. The turning point wasn't dramatic. I want to be honest about that. I think people expect a story like this to have a big cinematic moment, a windfall, a mentor, a sudden realization. Mine didn't. What actually happened is that a coworker, someone earning roughly the same as me, mentioned in passing she'd been putting $25 into an investment account every single payday for about a year. $25. Not 100, not 500. 25. I remember thinking it sounded almost pointless, too small to matter, and I nearly said so out loud. But something about the consistency of it stuck with me instead of the amount. She wasn't waiting until she had more breathing room. She'd decided the breathing room would never arrive on its own, so she'd built the habit around the tiny amount she actually had. I went home that week and set up an automatic transfer for exactly $25, twice a month, the same days my paycheck landed, so I'd never actually see the money sitting in my checking account, long enough to talk myself out of it. Here's the part of this story most people skip, because it's less inspiring than the ending. That habit did almost nothing for the first 2 years. I want to say that plainly, because pretending it felt meaningful early on would be dishonest. $50 a month for 2 years is around $1,200, plus whatever modest growth happened on top of it. It wasn't life-changing. It didn't feel like progress most months. There was one stretch, about 18 months in, where my car needed a repair that cost close to $600. I genuinely sat down and calculated exactly how many months of that transfer it would take to cover it, if I just paused the whole thing. The math was tempting. Pausing it felt completely reasonable, arguably even responsible. I remember opening the account settings, hovering over the button, and sitting there for what felt like several full minutes before closing the laptop without touching it. I didn't stop it, mostly out of stubbornness rather than any deep financial wisdom. And I think that honesty matters. I didn't stick with it because I understood compound interest deeply, or because I had some visionary sense of my future self. I stuck with it because quitting felt like admitting the habit had been a waste, and my pride didn't want to admit that yet. Looking back, that's a strange, almost accidental reason to build the single most important financial habit of my 20s, but it's the true one. By year 4, something shifted, and this is where the math finally started to feel real instead of theoretical. I'd gotten 2 modest raises by then, nothing dramatic. And each time, instead of letting my spending quietly absorb the extra money, I increased that automatic transfer along with it. 25 became 40. 40 eventually became 75. The account, which had felt embarrassingly small for years, had crossed somewhere around $8,000. And for the first time, an unexpected expense didn't feel like a crisis. It felt like an inconvenience I could actually absorb. Here's the lesson, and it's not the one I expected to learn back when I was living through it. I used to think the lesson would be about the specific investment choices, or the exact percentage to save, or some clever trick that accelerated everything. It wasn't. The actual lesson is that the habit mattered enormously more than the amount. Especially at the very beginning, when the amount was genuinely too small to matter on its own. $25 didn't build my financial freedom. The unbroken habit of moving money before I could spend it, sustained through years when it felt pointless, is what eventually did. I think this gets lost in most financial advice, because specific numbers and clever strategies make for better content than the true underlying lesson, which is almost embarrassingly simple. If you're currently in a version of those low-income years I described, feeling like there's nothing meaningful you can actually set aside, I'm not going to tell you $25 will transform your life quickly, because it won't, and I'd be lying if I said otherwise. What I will tell you is that the habit you build while the amount feels pointless is the same habit that will still be running once the amount finally isn't pointless anymore. And by then, stopping it will feel far harder than starting it ever did. Fast forward to today, and the difference isn't dramatic in the way movies make wealth look. I don't drive anything flashy. My apartment isn't much bigger than that first one. What's actually different is quieter than that. It's standing in a grocery store checkout line now without doing any mental math at all. Not because I've stopped caring about money, but because the checking out with dread feeling simply isn't part of my life anymore. It's getting a car repair estimate and paying it the same week without a second thought. It's the absence of that low-grade dread I described earlier, which turns out to have been the actual thing I was working toward the entire time, more than any specific number. I think this gets lost in most financial advice, because specific numbers and clever strategies make for better content than the true underlying lesson. So if there's one thing worth taking from this story, it's this. Don't wait for an amount that feels meaningful before you start. Build the habit at whatever size actually fits your real life right now, even if it embarrasses you a little, even if it takes years before it feels like it's doing anything. Because 10 years from now, the version of you looking back won't remember the $25. They'll remember whether you kept going.